Something I wanted to talk about for a while is the popularity of Nietzscheanism in online political spaces. And just as popularity more generally among people that are sort of discontented with the modern world. Oftentimes people turn to Nietzsche as a source of solace or inspiration, and people that feel alienated by the modern system. But the question is Nietzsche a fundamental challenge to modernity? Is he the answer to the problems that plague us? And from my perspective, being sort of among the, shall we say, dissident right, oftentimes there's this kind of split between the Nietzschean side of things and the Christian side of things. Really, the two philosophers of the distant right, you could say, are Jesus and Nietzsche. And that's an interesting place for someone like me to be, because, personally I'm not a Christian, but I actually have much more problems with the Nietzschean perspective than I do with the Christian perspective. And it's maybe a controversial thing to say now, but I think that Christianity, for all its faults, is much more of a challenge to modernity than Nietzscheanism. But on the point of Nietzsche is obviously very much worth reading and is a hugely important philosopher. And I find Nietzsche important not so much for his conclusions as for the wealth of suggestion in him and the problems that he presents. Nietzsche was the first philosopher that I read, and I think that's actually a good place to start, just to start with Nietzsche, because he presents to you sort of all the challenges, all of the problems that we moderns face, that we have to confront and ultimately find a solution to. And this is the death of God analogy. Not only is God dead, not only is belief in God dead, but with God, the absolute is dead. And absolute truth, absolute morality, a source for the things we value, truth, beauty, goodness. All of these things essentially lose their foundation with the death of God. Medieval philosophy and scholasticism started with God to reason its way to all of these things. Natural law, all of this stuff was built on an understanding of the divine. And so, the problem for moderns isn't just that God is dead, but it's that even the coherent belief in something like the medievals believed isn't possible anymore. And this is the fundamental challenge of Nietzsche. And when I first read Nietzsche, it actually pushed me towards sort of radical left politics. My conclusions from reading Nietzsche and sort of taking on the challenge of Nietzsche was to move to a kind of post-left, like Sternright anarchism, this kind of egoistic anarchism where it's a politics based on the absolute affirmation of ego, of the self, the doing away with all moral codes and moral systems. And this led me to kind of critique the left, and that the modern left was so moralistic. It had all of these sort of Christian notions bound in it, and so that's what drew me to this more sort of radical, sort of post-left kind of anarchism. And there's many Nietzsches. I mean, Nietzsche inspired postmodernism. He inspired someone like Heidegger. He's popular on the dissident right. He's popular on the dissident left. He's popular in anarchist circles. He's popular with feminists. There are so many Nietzsches that one can read into his work, stemming from all of these problems. But I still sort of hold on to that belief that a kind of post-left Sternright anarchism is kind of the proper interpretation of Nietzsche. If Nietzsche was the be-all and end-all for me, I probably would still be affirming something like a kind of post-left anarchy. Because, the postmoderns have the proper understanding of Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is a modernist, but the seeds of postmodernism are there in that, if everything is will to power, if truth or will to truth is just an expression of the will to power, then you end up with someone like Foucault, who says that all truth, all organizations of society are just power relations. and that we can do a genealogy of those societies, of those social orders, as Nietzsche did a genealogy of Christianity, and we can uncover the power structures underlying these various institutions, be it marriage or the family or whatever else. We can see the systems of domination and power that gave rise to them. So it only made sense that some of Nietzsche's thought was incorporated by Marxist thinkers in the 20th century, by postmodernists like Foucault. But that is to say that Nietzsche is not necessarily a right-wing thinker. And it's also to say that, you know, the point is, and this I think is the important point, is that when we challenge the modern, the postmodern understanding of the world, to oppose it on the basis of Nietzscheanism, I think, is fundamentally limited. Because if you think of the things that Nietzsche affirms, relativism, no absolute truth, a denial, a hatred of morality, seeing the world in terms of power relations, everything is will to power. All of these things fit in nicely with the modern relativist worldview. And what you often find with people on the right, and this is a kind of psychological critique I have of many Nietzscheans I encounter, sort of similar to a kind of critique William James might have made, a kind of Jamesian critique, is that I don't really believe that most Nietzscheans have properly internalized Nietzsche. And what I mean by that is, most people, for example, that come into the dissident right or become, say, nationalists, they will do that on the basis of moral reasoning. And then, you encounter them a few months later, and they're affirming Nietzscheans, and they're saying, well, actually, they're affirming Nietzscheanism, and actually they're saying, well, actually, no group is good or evil, no system is good or evil, and I don't blame the people in power for exploiting us, because if we were in power, we would exploit them, and it's all power relations. And so they sacrifice the moral argument and say, well, my argument is my tribe, and basically my morality is that I want my people to flourish. And that becomes kind of tricky in itself, because when they've sacrificed a sense of morality or any absolute truths, the only way to justify collectivism is for an affirmation of egotism. In other words, from this very egoistic will to power perspective, there's really, there's no kind of collective moral appeal that can be made other than you want your group to flourish as an extension of your will to power, as an extension of your flourishing. And so it is this kind of collective egotism, which to me is much less powerful than the more compelling arguments that bring people there in the first place. So I have this kind of Jamesian critique of them, in that fundamentally I don't actually believe that they believe that, because they will always, despite affirming Nietzscheanism, they will always come back to arguments of morality, they'll always come back to arguments of injustice, they'll always come back to notions of, a healthy society that is kind of presupposing certain transcendent or absolute truths. And you find that in these kinds of conversations about politics, about how the world should be organised, that not only do people presuppose these kinds of notions, but that it's not really possible to have a coherent discourse without them. If we're all Nietzscheans, if we're, if there's a few post-left Nietzscheans and a few alt-right Nietzscheans and whatever else, moral discourse is essentially impossible. And so it is this sense of just competing wills of I want my group to prosper, I want my group to prosper. And that makes discourse increasingly impossible, and you get the conclusion is what you see on the postmodern left, which is silencing the opposition, treating academia as just something that's there to express the power of certain groups, and so silencing the groups that you want to weaken, denying that there's any fundamental good to truth. Why should we teach Plato or David Hume or any of these white males when we could be promoting people that will give the students a certain political sense that will benefit us. And so, the elite itself is kind of fundamentally Nietzschean. I mean, you have to understand, again, if you think of Nietzsche as a fundamental challenge to modernity, I mean, in some ways he was a fundamental challenge to some of the currents of modernity, like egalitarianism and certain notions of progress. But if you look at Nietzsche's influence, he was actually very influential on the trend of modernism in the early 20th century, late 19th century. And, you know, if you look at the characteristics of modernism, because modernism really did a lot to transform the West, and that we talk about the problem of liberalism, which is obviously the source of much of the problems we can identify in the modern West. But you know, liberalism, even in the mid 19th century, was racialist. You know, there were people that identified as English liberals that were racial supremacists for Anglos. It was, you know, it didn't deny science. It was very empirical, even race science. It was Christian. It was all of these things. And there was a fundamental change. There was a fundamental shift to a kind of cultural liberalism, which was brought with the advent of modernism. And modernists across the board were very much inspired by Nietzsche, because if you look at the ethic of modernism, people like, say, you know, people you can think of like Oscar Wilde or James Joyce or H.L. Mencken, Orson Welles, all these people. The ethic is very much one of liberation of the individual. It's this idea of the elite sort of transcending the herd. One key component is a hatred of the masses, a disgust for sort of bourgeois Christian morality, a disgust for what's popular, a tendency to turn literature, to turn the arts, to turn philosophy into things that are increasingly obscure. Things that, you know, appeal to a very small subsection of the elite. These are all the tenets of modernism, and these are all found especially in Nietzsche. You know, you look at someone like George Bernard Shaw and his plays about the Superman, very much inspired by Nietzsche's conception of the Übermensch. That was H.G. Wells, by the way. That's been bugging me since, but I think I said Orson Welles. But you know, you look at something like you know, the kind of philosophy that someone like Oscar Wilde would have put out, which is that, you know, man should turn his life into a work of art, and everything should be this aesthetic sort of revolt against bourgeois morality and mentality. And again, these are all things that are kind of found in Nietzsche. You know, the affirmation of the Dionysian, all these kinds of things, was very much internalized by the Western elite throughout the 20th century, and really gave rise from the top down to this kind of cultural liberalism, to the point where, you know, you have modern art that is completely divorced from the popular masses. No one understands it, no one appreciates it for good reason. You have postmodern philosophy that increasingly moved away from metaphysics, epistemology, any of these things, and became increasingly sort of self-referential, and the hold of French academics very separated from what the masses actually believed, how they actually, you know, the problems they actually faced. And, you know, the point is that to imagine that Nietzscheanism would be some kind of fundamental transformation of society, well, I mean, I think we saw that in the 20th century. You know, you can say, well, the elites aren't properly Nietzschean because, you know, what are they doing? This pathetic neoliberal elite, you know, we're not going to the stairs, we're not really expressing the will to power. But in a certain sense, you know, the Western elite is kind of Nietzschean. You know, the Western elite has kind of, you know, it's completely separated itself from any notion of the common good. It's completely separated itself from the masses, and it is engaged in this kind of Dionysian affirmation of life. And it has kind of internalized the morality, the philosophy of Nietzsche. Now, you could counter that and say, well, there's still a strong Christian element there in the kind of social causes they promote and that kind of thing, and that's a counterpoint. But I think for the most part, if you look at the transformation and the consciousness of the elite in the 20th century, someone like H.L. Mencken, the essayist who was popular in the United States, You look at, say, the literature of someone like James Joyce, the stream of consciousness literature, Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake. Same with Henry James, who invented the stream of consciousness style of writing, which comes from this, again, this turn in philosophy, this turn in intellectual thought, where everything becomes inward-looking, everything becomes an affirmation of the subjective. And what's left with this kind of Nietzschean understanding is that all that's left is kind of fleeting experience. There's no universals, there's no absolute truth. And so as much as art becomes a kind of affirmation of the ephemeral, an affirmation of hedonism, of the artist itself, literature becomes this kind of exploration of the inward as well, kind of separated from any moral truths, any traditional narratives, very much focused on the subjective, on the fleeting. Again, you can see this in like the psychology of William James, and this is all one current of modernism, and Nietzsche is probably a better exponent of that way of seeing the world than anyone. So, when we look at the West and when we see the problems we face, I don't think the problem when I look at what's going on is a lack of Nietzscheanism. When I look at how our elites are behaving, what I see is that the problem is that our elites feel separated from the mass. They not only do they not feel that they represent the mass of people, but they have utter contempt for us. And you see this all of the time. I mean, today a building in the University of Edinburgh was renamed it was named after David Hume, the Scottish philosopher. It was renamed after George Floyd. And you see these kinds of things all the time in arts, in the kind of things that are promoted through the media. You look at something like Cuties on Netflix that's caused all of this controversy. You can go and you can see like a 93% approval rating from media, from journalists on a website like Rotten Tomatoes. The audience score is like 5-8%. And you see this all of the time. The elite are affirming this revolt against bourgeois morality all of the time. We see it in all of these major social movements. We see it in the postmodern left. We see it in all the projects of woke capital. And what's lacking is a kind of populism. There is a kind of wisdom of the masses, and that most people do have an internalized sense of morality that somewhat conforms to a natural law, a natural order. People are attracted to beautiful art, to classical art and architecture and storytelling, and these things that are increasingly the preserve of an elite fly in the face of that. So when I look at the problems facing the modern world, to me it's not that we haven't sufficiently realized the death of God and sufficiently sort of affirmed a life-affirming ethic that flies in the face of traditional morality. To me, the problem is a lack of morality. It's lack of morality itself. We need some concept of the transcendent. We need a vertical order from which we can understand the horizontal order. That to me is what's lacking, whether it's in philosophy or the arts or politics or anything else. And it has gotten to the point where it's even made discourse around these things impossible. And these are all the kind of currents that we see in Nietzsche. So is Nietzsche a fundamental challenge to modernity? I think the answer would have to be no. And this really gets to the point, that from the perspective as well of a dissident movement, there is a need for a compelling moral narrative. If you look at something like the dissident right, which is obviously more important to me personally, or say a nationalist cause, the only thing that we have on our side, we don't have power, we don't have elites, we don't have money. We've got the whole system apparatus against us. Really, the only thing that we have on our side, or so we believe, is truth and a conception of justice, and that fundamentally we are right, that we believe the right things, that we want a better world. And so to me, to sacrifice that and to sort of go to the postmodern left to go to the neoliberal elite that is currently destroying the world, on the way to destroying the world through ecological crisis, through these sort of suicidal political ideologies that we have adopted in the West and that we are increasingly exporting to the rest of the world through neoliberalism. To go and say that actually, we actually understand this perspective, we actually affirm this perspective, that we fundamentally respect that the elite has kind of revolted against the masses and is affirming these views that nobody likes, but that basically that we just want, like, wouldn't it be great aesthetically if like our group had power, or if we were building spaceships to colonize Mars, or wouldn't it be great aesthetically if we adopted stronger affirmation of a kind of master morality and embraced the more hardened manly virtues? To me, again, that's not really a fundamental challenge. The fundamental challenge is that the modern worldview, the postmodern worldview, is built on a faulty understanding of the world. This idea of nominalism that has come to dominate, that is really what separated the medieval or traditionalist worldview from the modern worldview. Nominalism is the philosophical idea that there's no universals, that a conception of man, a conception of the good, even numbers and mathematics. Nominalists have trouble explaining numbers, for one thing. But nominalism is the belief that it is just kind of matter in flux, and that there are no universals, and ultimately there is no truth. And this was kind of, again, the fundamental split between scholasticism and modernity, but also the presupposed affirmation of materialism in Nietzsche. And the will to power, to me, is not really coherent in that when Nietzsche talks about the will to live, or existence as the will to power, to me it's better understood in Schopenhauer's understanding as the will to live. And when Nietzsche sort of counters that and says that the higher forms of life and the desire for unlimited power, that is kind of an expression of the will to power, to me it's much more easily understood as more classical philosophers will understand it as that is more that people seek power for happiness, and the traditionalist understanding of that would be that happiness essentially is freedom, that happiness is equated with freedom, and that freedom comes from higher forms of consciousness, from a detachment from the egoic self, from the realization of higher truths, from one's real identity, that sort of frees one from the bondage of being the little I, the ego. And what that traditionalist metaphysic led to was an affirmation of the higher, an affirmation of the transcended. And there is something in the conception of the Übermensch, there is something there. And there is something there that traditional philosophers would assert as well, but what they would say is that what Nietzsche is lacking is that the Übermensch is always sort of his conception of it is always suggesting something transcendent. It's always suggesting something higher. If you adopt the materialist, nominalist view of Nietzscheans, the concept of an Übermensch becomes kind of meaningless. But again, in a traditionalist understanding, there are people that achieve these higher states of consciousness, that achieve real freedom, and it's oftentimes from those kinds of people that we derive then, morality and these things from. And that morality is just an expression of egoism is false. It's actually an expression of post-rational truths that are difficult to understand rationally, and so they're handed down from people that have achieved post-rational states of consciousness. Now Nietzsche denies all of this. He has scorn for Eastern traditions, Eastern philosophy, which he doesn't really understand, and in rejection of them he affirms the flesh, which is a big error in my opinion. And he misunderstands, he sees Buddhism, he sees many of the Eastern traditions as nihilism, as life denying. But that's because he has this materialist worldview where he denies that there could be a higher order, that there could be higher states of consciousness, that there could be kind of post-rational truths not accessible from the point of view of the self-affirmative ego. And so the absolute affirmation of egoism is a trap, really, and it flies in the face of all ancient philosophy, all traditions, all philosophy before Nietzsche, really, which said that the ego was essentially something of a barrier, something that had to be integrated to a higher level of consciousness, something that not repressed or destroyed, or even people have a false understanding of sort of the Eastern conception of things, that you like kill your ego, but something that's properly integrated into a higher self. But again, all of these discussions presuppose a higher order, and what we have now is you talk to people that are Nietzscheans, and there isn't very far you can go, because many of them will not engage seriously with philosophy, in that they will, a discussion of metaphysics is off the table. They just presuppose materialism. Of course, materialism is true. Of course, everything is matter and the void in flux. They presuppose nominalism. They will not take seriously a doctrine like idealism, which says that consciousness or the mind is before matter, that matter exists contingently on our consciousness, our souls. They will reject all of these things, and so it's like, while we're supposedly the great challengers to modernity, at the end of the day, these kinds of people oftentimes have an identical worldview, epistemologically, metaphysically, everything. They have an identical worldview to Richard Dawkins, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Nye, any of these people. It's just more materialism, more scientism, but they want a different aesthetic to their materialism. And, again, I can see people criticizing this from various aesthetic points of view, but the point is that they won't critique it from an epistemological point of view, or if they do, they'll just presuppose a nominalist sort of materialist understanding of the world. And that's the fundamental problem, is that not only do Nietzscheans most times not challenge those presuppositions that make up the modern worldview, but they completely reify them. They think that conversation about them is impossible. They think that philosophers before Nietzsche were just talking nonsense, that these questions have no meaning, that it's all power relations. And if we look at I would say the modern worldview, I would say modernism culturally, again, is all of those things. It's the disgust for bourgeois morality, the affirmation of the individual, of the self, all of these things. But if we look at modernity in terms of the kind of ontological assumptions, it's really this kind of atheistic Newtonian worldview where essentially everything is matter. There is no meaning, there is no universals. Life and consciousness is emergent from matter. Consciousness is some kind of illusion. It doesn't exist independently of matter. But somehow, through the sort of chaotic crashing of atoms, it sort of spontaneously arose. And I think this kind of worldview is kind of absurd for a number of reasons. I think that materialism as a philosophy never made sense, and people have this false notion that science is kind of proven materialism, when in fact the opposite is true if you look at something like quantum theory. But the modern ontology is materialism, scientism, progressivism materially. It doesn't have to be progressivism politically. There were plenty of progressives in the early 20th century that were race realists and racial supremacists and whatnot. But that is the fundamental ontology of modernity, and you even see Christians presuppose this. And this is why it's a problem, when you fall into this false dichotomy where you critique a Nietzschean and they'll say, they'll make a critique of Christianity back. And in fact, oftentimes those critiques of Christianity are just as spot on And they're absolutely right, because even modern Christians, and this was something that Genon wrote about a lot, that in fact, and Evola, that in fact, 95% of Christians can't really be called religious at all, because the modern assumptions about the world have been so ingrained, have been so internalized, that for most Christians, they shared this kind of view of the world, but they just add God. The world is, material, again, all of the same assumptions of the people that believe in scientism, but there's a personal theistic God in another realm that's watching this unfold, and maybe he interferes with it and gives someone a park in space if they've been well behaved. And again, this is completely cut off from what, from how religion was always understood. Religion, the world in a religious sense, was always seen as a kind of emanation of a divine reality, and that truth, beauty, goodness, that the transcendentals were kind of lesser forms of an absolute reality. But the notion of materialism, or the notion of dualism, that there was this kind of fundamental separation between mind and matter, really didn't exist in traditional worldviews, and it's really only a problem that presents itself in modernity. So, the point is, if we look at the root of our problem, we see that Christians and Nietzscheans and progressive leftists, the fundamental problem to me is that they all have completely internalized this, Newtonian sort of clockwork view of the universe that doesn't have a fundamental philosophical basis. That's really based on a kind of 17th century sort of scientific understanding of the world, much of which is outdated, and that was never sound philosophically to begin with, that could never answer the hard problem of consciousness, that could never explain fundamental issues that have always plagued and continue to plague philosophers. To me, materialism was always the worst explanation. And so the fundamental problem is that even though we have competing moral narratives, okay, you have a Nietzschean that wants race-based societies and an affirmation of the Übermensch, a total denial of liberal morality and of degeneracy. You have Christians that could fall into either camp, sort of left or right, and you have the sort of progressive postmodern left that are just sort of affirming this nihilistic individualism and the destruction of traditional orders, of natural barriers to what they want to do. And although they all have competing moral narratives, they all share that same ontology. They all share that very modern ontology. And to me, any truly distant movement that really wants to call itself a distant movement, that's really revolting against this modern world order, would fundamentally challenge that. And to me, it is kind of disappointing. It's unfortunate that conversations about this kind of thing on the right are almost impossible, again, because the most fundamental truths about reality have been internalized and have been taken from the same people that are currently wrecking society and that are currently pushing these social movements that we have. And to me, the fundamental way to challenge it, a different aesthetic, a different ethic that has no fundamental basis, isn't a challenge at all. To me, it has to be challenged from that fundamental ontological level, from the fundamental starting point of what we believe about the world and what we can know about the world. And I firmly believe that from that perspective we can say that the people in power, that the modern left is both wrong and evil in what it's doing. Whereas, if we affirm Nietzscheanism, there is fundamentally no basis on which you can say anything is wrong. In this materialist, nominalist worldview, everything is matter and flux. You can't, you're just affirming your will over another, but your will is just an evolutionary adaptation. It's no better or worse than anyone else's. As Foucault has explained, all of these things are just power relations. And I think that worldview is false, and I think it can be demonstrated to be false. But I'm not going to give a whole exposition on why materialism is false, or what like an alternative ontology could be, or how morality could be grounded. Fundamentally, the only point is that just to recognize that the challenge that Nietzscheanism presents to modernism and postmodernism is fundamentally limited in that regard. It's only attacking it on a very much a surface level. But in terms of attacking the foundations, or in terms of fundamentally challenging the basis, I think Nietzscheanism will always be lacking in that regard.